Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 12th of July. Today we're looking at important developments from Urozhaine, Novoselivka Persha, Vozdvyzhenka, and the Touretsk axis. We're going to afterwards look at really important updates regarding the integration of thousands of Ukrainian prisoners into the military, including a new battalion that was formed as part of the 24th Mechanized Brigade. But we're going to begin by looking at Urozhaine, where we do have a Russian advance amounting to, let's see, about 200 meters. And this is based off of geolocation, which was released by the 37th Motor Rifle Brigade, the Russian unit that really has been at the forefront of advances through this hamlet. They were involved in the fighting over the past 2 months in conquering the southern warehouses, which took really a long time. And the reason why is because even though the Ukrainian garrison in the Velika Novosilka sector has been substantially degraded over the past year, it is so difficult to advance through this one narrow pass. And that is the really totality of the entire theater of battle over here. You're not seeing many clashes to the east or to the west. And so everything really amounts to fighting on one particular road. And so then the manpower advantage does become less important, and then advancing with a column of vehicles has become very, very difficult when you're relying on only one path that is just constantly targeted by Ukrainian drones, ATGMs, and artillery. And that's what we saw for a while. But once the Russian vehicles and troops were able to dismount and solidify control in the south, they had this sort of opportunity to continue advancing into the residential areas of Urozhaine. That started happening, a couple of months ago. And now we have the first advance here of a substantial amount that's worth noting in a very, very long time. And so it's now the Russian priority to try to push through the rest of the residential areas. But I do expect that it will take a rather long period of time to go through and clear out the basements here. Although the houses themselves, they have just been completely destroyed because this is the third battle in this village. And so you could just understand how most of them have been pulverized. And speaking of that, we look here at a video from July 12th. It comes from the Vostok group. That's a DPR affiliated unit that played a big role in the Russian attempt at defending against the Ukrainian counteroffensive and their capture of Urozhaine last year by now. And in this video, you can see how the Vostok group, which has a particular emphasis on drones, their FPV actually destroys a Ukrainian tank. It causes an ammo cook-off. And then the tank at the end, you could see how it's sort of swerving, trying to get itself under control, and crashes into houses and just catches on fire. And so that was a part of the Ukrainian efforts to send in some reinforcements because they do have some tanks present in this area. It's one of the areas where we know they have tanks present. And they eventually were spotted and repulsed by the Russian side. And so generally, the Ukrainian situation in Urozhaine has deteriorated, not just because of frontal assaults, but also because of Staromayorska's fall. The Russian forces capturing it a couple of weeks ago, it gave the Russians this direct western flank, which just immediately looks towards the Ukrainian positions located on a valley right next to the Mokryali River. And then the Russian forces, they also got control over additional hills and ridges just west of Staromayorsk, which helped them overlook the village itself. Not to mention how they do have control over parts of the hills east of Urozhaine. And so all in all, it is very difficult from a topographic standpoint to maintain control over Urozhaine when you zoom in and analyze the differences. And then looking at the broader garrison in Velika Novosilka, recently the Ukrainians have moved away the 253rd Array Assault Battalion, and that unit was involved in a lot of the fighting here in trying to repel Russian assaults. They've been moved to defend around Volchansk. And you had elements, of course, of the 1st Tank Brigade that were moved elsewhere. And just generally, you had the Marine Brigades and Special Forces Brigades that were moved over the course of over half a year now. Looking at the Pokrovsk direction, we have a really important update. There's a video that was released today. It's a part of a Ukrainian compilation of various FPV drones striking Russian soldiers and drones dropping grenades. And so here we have a video of those drones dropping rather small grenades onto Russian individual soldiers. It wasn't any large quantity of troops, but they were hiding in bushes or within the warehouses, destroyed warehouses, as a part of the broader agricultural facility in northern Novoselivka Persha. indicating that the Russians were able to get this sort of bridgehead in the northern portion of the village. And again, I didn't actually see any of the soldiers get directly impacted by it, but it does confirm that they're present here. And what it means is that the Russian forces were actually able to infiltrate from the northeastern direction, as I talked about in my last video. And they did this by advancing first from Novopokrovsk, where they had this forward operating garrison, advancing along the nearby ponds and tree lines, and then making their way into the warehouses or what remains of them. And this meant that there was no way for the Ukrainians to control this large trench system over here, which, if you're looking at the way it's positioned, in theory, it was meant to defend against basically horizontal Russian attacks occurring perpendicular to the road. But you know how the situation developed in a way that the Ukrainians had not anticipated or not hoped for, because the Russian forces a couple of weeks ago captured Sokil and then from there advanced along the northern flank and were able to get control over the fields, looking over Novoselivka Persha from the north, and in doing so, in addition to the attacks from Novopokrovsk, basically rendered this trench system superfluous. So what does this mean? It means that at the very least, the Russians have a limited presence in the northern section, but what it could mean is that the reports are a bit delayed, perhaps by a day, 24 hours, or even more at this point. We don't exactly know, because there has been a bit of operational secrecy surrounding this village that I've noticed from Russian channels, saying that the situation is a bit fluid, but definitely it could mean that there are Russian forces operating even deeper in the village, in the center, for instance, and there are murmurs from the Russian side of Ukrainians organizing reinforcements to conduct counterattacks and try to push the Russians out. But so far, there's no indication that they've been successful. But it does seem like the Ukrainians are trying to remain steadfast here, which means moving in elements of the 61st Mechanized Brigade, 68th Jaeger Brigade, and maybe even taking troops from further south, like the 25th Air Assault Brigade. The reason the Ukrainians want to drag out the fighting here is because the fall of Novoselivka Persha would mean the fall of all of these fields and Yaznobordivka that are located east of the Vavcha River, which means the Ukrainians would not have any more time to connect their trenches, to organize their defenses a couple of kilometers westwards across the river. And so they would be at a bigger risk of losing or basically being exposed in certain portions of their new defense line, which they've really been banking on for a while. And it's been a big reason why they've expended a lot of resources in holding the line eastwards in order to just give their forces on the rear more time to set up defenses. And so they're trying to just extend it a little bit more by defending in Novoselivka Persha. But if we're looking into the future, we can see that the Russian forces have been able to strengthen their positions directly north of the village, capturing additional portions of these fields. And in the process, they do have a very strong presence now right next to the river in this pond region over here. And it means that they're also rather close to the crossings past the river. And so the Russian forces are positioning themselves in a way in which they'd be able to undermine the Ukrainian defense line in a premature manner before the Ukrainians are fully prepared for it. And that could be in the area around Novoselivka Persha or just to the west of it. But it could also be regarding areas like Prokhrez and Vovche that are increasingly coming under Russian bombardment and just physically are very close to the front line and are just simply not good areas to defend when you analyze the dynamics surrounding elevation, the amount of troop density or trench density. And as we move forward, we can also see the Russian forces are pushing into Vozdvyzhenka, a village which I've not talked about much, but given the Russian advance past Novoselivka, it is going to become very important. And so, just as a quick reminder, this entire line over here that I'm marking in green that eventually crosses past or just runs along the highway, this entire region is located on a rather low elevation. There's a bit of a floodplain running along this region, and the largest village in this region is Tarasivka, if you can see over there. And so a bit further south, you have Vozdvyzhenka, which is just completely overlooked by basically this hill located east, which is split between Russian and Ukrainian control. And it's why I've been saying for a while, the Russian forces do have an interest in getting control over this region before conducting any sort of additional advances. But if we zoom in, the Russian forces are actually continuing to push directly northwest of Novoselivka. It's a really important village for them because within like a 5-kilometer radius, there aren't any other settlements. which means this area is a sole organizing node for forward companies or even smaller squads that then want to branch out and begin attacking towards the Ukrainian lines. And they do need to have that organized point with basements to try to seek cover in. And so they also have this road over here that bisects Oleksandrivka and then moves its way to Vozdvyzhenka. And as we go further north as well to the ring road that is a part of the highway that connects between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka, as I've discussed so many times, so I won't delve into it right now. But if we measure the distance, the Russians are now about 5 or 6 kilometers away from that particular ring road, and they are at the approaches of this specific village. And the trench that was built on its eastern entrance is already within the gray zone, which does pose big threats to this village as it is not protected really anywhere else besides on its northern flank over here. And the fall of the village would mean the Russians have direct access to continue advancing along the floodplain line that I discussed, undermining additional Ukrainian villages like Baranivka and Tarasivka, as we said. The big issue with this would be that the Russians would simply be too close to the highway, and by that point, they would be able to either physically impair the Ukrainians' ability to cross over it, or they'd be able to move artillery even closer to the front line, because right now it's around Ochartina for like some of the shorter range howitzers or mortars. Mortars may be even closer to the front line, but then you can move it a couple of kilometers even further to the northwest, and that would put even more stress onto the Ukrainian logistics that are trying to pass this area on a daily basis. Another issue surrounding the fall of this village would be about the chain of villages running along the Torets River here, which is also a low-lying region which has various tributaries that are branching out, and they're also on low elevation. The fall of the Torets River line would mean that another natural barrier would be lost, and it's this river, Torets River, runs all the way very, very close to the perimeter of Mirnohrad, which is the eastern suburb of Pokrovsk, and is also in its own right a really important settlement. So as we zoom in, there are a lot of villages that are exposed to potential flanking from the north. If we look at it, like Timofivka, that's the one that stands out the most, and they're not prepared for a northwards flanking. No defenses were really built in that particular direction, and losing control over that area, that northern flank, also puts the Ukrainians that are located in an area like Hordivka in an exposed area. And I would really recommend looking into Hordivka, because I think in the future this village will become really significant, because it does serve as a sort of junction for local roads, and it serves as one of the largest settlements on the road to Mirnohrad, for instance. And so there's an issue with that village. There's also an issue with the Russians then being able to flank from the north, the new Ukrainian defense line located along all of those ridges we discussed just west of the Vavcha River. So I can't believe I didn't show this, but let's actually see the extent of the Russian advance that was reported on by Ukrainian sources last night. It's an advance of about 1.17 kilometers if we're looking at it, and I'll also mark it with this green marker here to indicate where they were able to advance through. And so you can see how it is directly along the road. Now looking at Toretsk, specifically New York, because this is now where we're seeing most of the developments, specifically east of Toretsk, there has been an influx of Ukrainian reinforcements. That could be one explanation for why there's less movement. The other one could be that there is a lot of fluidity in that some of the developments from the past 48 hours are being kept as sort of operational secrecy. I don't know for now. That's just a matter of time. Regarding the New York sector, there is a Russian advance that occurred yesterday, so I should have mentioned it. I guess I just missed it, but it's a Russian advance of 1.5 kilometers, stretching westwards just south of Urivka, allowing the Russian forces to get control over additional forested regions. And this is important because it does put stress on the Ukrainian forces, if there even are any remaining in some of these frontline positions, whether they be dugouts or just generally forested regions. And you may be confused by the mapping here. I think that there's an issue with my older mapping of the front line around here, because the Russians are really in control of this horizontal line. They're not in control over this region over here. And so ignore the overlap between blue and orange, because it is all under Ukrainian control, at least to my knowledge. But now that could change quickly, because there is this Russian flank that's pushing along this particular road, this paved road, leading even further westwards, which could be a threat to villages, for instance, like Oleksandropil, which is very important. Oleksandropil, not even regarding New York anymore, because the Russians are already in the really outskirts, knocking on the center of New York. But Alexander Peel also serves as a key to unlock the rest of the heights that the Ukrainians control in this region that are supposed to help protect the defense line the Ukrainians have set up on this sort of horizontal direction that you see marked in green over here. And so those heights are really important, and their vanguard is Alexander Peel. And then looking once again at New York, or at least its southern suburbs, you do have the ninth regiment, or actually this is 132nd separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade, accompanied by the 9th Motor Rifle Brigade. These two units are now solidifying further control over the houses that were previously marked as a gray zone, with the Russians advancing along this particular vertical paved road, and in the process also getting control over a large amount of houses in this region. So in terms of the vertical sort of advance here, it is something that amounts to 2 kilometers, but it is generally an area that was already abandoned by Ukrainian forces and was probably in the gray zone for a while. And so now the Russians are just solidifying control over there. So they have a very strong vector to push deeper into New York. And the final topic for today's video is surrounding the integration of inmates into the Ukrainian military. And so there was a really interesting article by militaryland.net, which I'm going to link in the description. And it explains how the 24th Mechanized Brigade, they formed this new battalion, which is just completely composed of inmates. They refer to them as former inmates. And so this is my one question surrounding this entire story. When they say former inmates, are they referring to inmates that were released and now are being allowed into the Ukrainian military? Or are they talking about soldiers or prisoners that were in prisons and are only being released because they're getting paroled and then getting sent to the front line? Because there is obviously a difference there, because you can have people that serve their sentence and are now living civilian life and then are being admitted into the military, and that would be different than just directly snatching people from prisons. I think it's the latter, but there is just a bit of ambiguity there. And what they're saying is that this battalion is going to be composed of roughly 300 to 400 inmates. So it's not necessarily like a full battalion size, but the number could definitely increase in the future, because the amount of prisoners in each Ukrainian brigade that allows them does really vary. In some cases, they amount to just individual companies, and they're individual because they're fighting on their own. They don't want to really mix them up with the rest of the Ukrainian units that aren't prisoners. But in some cases, you do actually have integration of prisoners directly into the regular units, fighting alongside civilians that didn't commit any crimes before joining into the military. Now, if you guys recall, the 24th Mechanized Brigade, it is currently operating in the Chasiv Yar region, moved on June 19th, rather infamously, from Toretsk to Chasiv Yar, played a big role in at least trying to stabilize the front line following Russian advances in the Canal District. And so they're going to play an integral role in defending Chasiv Yar in the months to come. And so definitely they need these men to come within that time frame in order to just protract the fighting. And then there is a level of irony because, this is the same sector where the Wagner Group made its name, and prisoners were involved in a lot of the assaults south of Bakhmut, within Bakhmut, from the Wagner Group. And then you have now, on the other side, some prisoners, on a lesser extent in this particular case, about 300 to 400 operating within this battalion that will be defending in Chasiv Yar. But that is not the full story, because there are many more units that have allowed now for a period of several months Ukrainian inmates to join. And, there's certain information surrounding how many have actually applied to join that's coming out from the Ukrainian Justice Ministry. They're saying that 5,000 have applied to join, and that about 3,000 have already received parole to actually go to the front line and get recruited into a particular unit. And according to the Ukrainian Justice Ministry, there's like 27,000 soldiers that would be, or not soldiers, but prisoners that would be eligible to sign up and become soldiers under the new law, the mobilization law that was passed by the Ukrainians, that allows some, and this is some because there are certain requirements and eligibility thresholds that prisoners have to meet in order to leave their prisons and go fight on the front lines. And so I think one of them is that you can't have a sentence that's more than 3 years. And then there's like specific sentences that are mentioned, like specific crimes that if you committed, you can't obviously serve on the front line for, including if you committed anything in relation to threats of national security to Ukraine. And then you can imagine what else, things that are rather heinous. So in terms of other units that allow prisoners, you have the 1st Assault Battalion Da Vinci, very important frontline unit that's engaged in a lot of drone activity and frontline assaults. You have also the 3rd Azov Assault Brigade, and they also take in a lot of volunteers. And so that may be a part of their ethos of then allowing prisoners in as well. And they actually integrate the prisoners directly into regular units. So that's interesting. And 3rd Assault Brigade is now operating on the Luhansk front, if you recall. You also have the 5th Assault Brigade, which is fighting just south of Bakhmut in the Klishivka, Andrivka area. So they will also be involved in some very heavy frontline activities. Same thing with the 28th Mechanized Brigade. They are operating right now, as we said, around Toretsk, and so they are also in need of some additional reinforcements from prisoners, for instance, and they do have some prisoners operating within the ranks. They also have the 92nd Assault Brigade. That unit previously was operating in the region around Klishivka and just south of it in that general theater, but is now committed to fighting in the Hliboke area. And recently, they've been involved in the advances directly into Hliboke, into some of its northern warehouses. That has been confirmed by geolocated footage, which does show that there has been a slight advance by the Ukrainian forces. And so I'll just go there quickly. So here you can see the geolocation for the Russian FPV strike onto a warehouse in northern Hliboke, confirming Ukrainian presence, at least in that portion of the village, which indicates a 1 kilometer advance to the east. But in any case, there's an interesting fun fact. The 92nd Brigade also has its own battalion specifically for prisoners, and the 225th Assault Battalion of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, a unit which is split between the Vovchansk Theater of Operations and the area just south of Chasiv Yar. It's 225th Battalion, as we know about, which isn't operating just strictly in the southern parts of the sector of this theater, Chasiv Yar, but also further north around the Canal District and the forested regions. It also allows prisoners into its ranks. And then you also have the 153rd Mechanized Brigade, and that's a unit that has not seen any combat experience yet. It's a unit that is still in formation, but is operating around the Kharkiv region right now in the stages of training. And so prisoners will also be involved in that process. And the last unit I'll mention is the 253rd Array Assault Battalion. If you recall, I talked about it earlier on in the video, and that unit also does allow prisoners now. And so we may begin seeing some of them operating in the Vovchansk theater now that that unit has been moved into that area. And so it is interesting to see how now the Ukrainians have made a decision to allow in. Right now, it's in the low thousands, but it could get higher depending on the amount of prisoners that are allowed in. But it is maximum of 27,000 based on the new Ukrainian law. And there are a total of 42,000 prisoners in the Ukrainian penal system. And so that is something very interesting as we go forward and talk about certain issues with Ukrainian manpower, and then those prisoners being the solution to fill their shoes in some of the most bloody and some of the most active parts of the front line. In terms of quality, there's not much there with some of these prisoners, although some of them may have actually been ex-servicemen that couldn't integrate into civilian life. And so in that case, maybe they would actually have a better experience. Some other Ukrainian recruits that didn't have previous military experience. But in a lot of cases, it could be even worse for various reasons relating to behavior and, just generally having a lack of experience. And of course, these units will also have a higher casualty percent, higher proportions than any other Ukrainian units. That's a part of why they were even let in, because the Ukrainian command can be more flexible with utilizing them in ways that they wouldn't be with other units that are involved in frontline fighting. And that's something that they really need in order to hold certain key parts of the front line that we've talked about today, and other parts that I didn't even discuss today, in order to buy time for future defense lines to be built and for other cities to be prepared for defensive activities. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.